I'd spent the better part of a decade really trying to prove my worth in the workplace. And I had landed what on paper was the dream job, but I didn't feel good inside. I felt very anxious. I didn't feel secure in myself. And then I was with my child who really only wanted me to be me. And for the first time in as long as I could imagine, I belonged, and I wanted to explore that version of myself.
Hey friends, and welcome to the Paula Faris Show. I am your host, Paula. And to be honest, I wasn't sure that I was going to be able to release an episode this week. Like a lot of folks that are struggling because of the after effects of the hurricane, we live in the upstate of South Carolina, and this might be the first time that some of my extended family members hear how I'm doing. We have been without internet, without power. Our power was just recently restored. I took a hot shower, which felt so good. But there are so many people struggling in North Carolina and South Carolina and Florida. A friend of mine, it's heartbreaking. She lives in Asheville. Her son had to be essentially rescued off of a rooftop. They're on their way from Asheville to another part of North Carolina. They said, we have a third of a gas tank. We're not sure if we can make it because every gas station is out of gas. So look, I think it's hard to know what to do at this point, right? I want to say thank you to the first responders in our area who were able to remove so many trees and restore power. But there are still, I believe, over 1 million people here in South Carolina that are without power. It's a very helpless feeling if you're not right there in it and knowing what to do. But look, just keep checking in on your loved ones, praying for them, helping in any way possible. And I just want to say a big shout out to all the first responders who came from all different states, West Virginia and Ohio and Florida, to help out in our state of South Carolina. But the cleanup effort is going to be ongoing. We are out of school several days this week. I know in Greenville, South Carolina, I don't believe that people are going to have power till the end of the week. So just pray for those real vulnerable people right now, the elderly, children, and pray that power can be restored. You don't really realize how dependent we are on it until you don't have it. So a big thanks to everybody who is helping and jumping in, and check on your loved ones, everybody. It just puts everything into perspective. At the worst of times, we often see the best in humanity. And I know from our perspective, we're definitely seeing people just rally around one another. Okay, so we wrapped up a series on perimenopause and menopause. I hope you listened to last week's episode with John, my husband, and Dr. Jen Ashton, as we talked about nutrition and exercise. And going forward, we are going to be talking about the hottest topics that you have requested. So the rest of the season through the end of the year, hot topics, the things that you have asked me to talk about. We're going to be talking about how to have the sex talk with your kids when they're young and when they're older, like I have teenagers, how to talk politics with your children and with your family members, how to negotiate with your kids and your partner. We have a former FBI hostage negotiator that's going to join the conversation. But this week, what I really wanted to lean into is why so many mothers and fathers are leaving the workforce. That's a big part of why I formed Carry Media, to help carry moms through these moments, but really to advocate for working moms. I believe being a working mom should work, and it just doesn't. The statistics are there. 1 in 2 of us are considering downshifting. 1 in 3 are planning on pausing in the very near future. I actually did an all call on my socials on Instagram, and I asked women and men, but mainly the responses were from women. I said, tell me why you're considering leaving the workforce or why you have, okay? And I'm going to read you about half the responses, so hold on. Denise says, I left when I had my boys, out for 10 years, back in, but looking forward to early retirement. Barbara says, my kids are grown, so I'm an older mom, but I quit my job to take care of my grandkids. Tanya says, I actually effectively resigned today because my kids are not okay. Dawn says, long haul, COVID, and also going back to school for a higher degree. Mama Ford says, there just wasn't enough of me to give completely to family and job, so the job went and my family trumped all. Meredith said, we had our 3rd kid, then added 2 foster babies. I want to be present and childcare is expensive. Lori says, I stayed home, but mercy, staying home was the hardest job I ever had. Mary says, it's hard to justify being away from my kids for this. These are real and raw and vulnerable answers. CJ McClamrock says, because I could work again when they go to college, but these years I never can get back. Better Travel with Teen says, I was tired of the commute and the cubicle. I can relate to that one. And then Becky says, my mom was diagnosed with Alzheimer's and I just didn't have the bandwidth to do it all. There are so many mothers and women and dads too that are leaving the workforce because it just doesn't work for them. Again, 1 in 2 are considering downshifting, 1 in 3 are considering pausing. So I wanted to invite our new friend. Her name is Neha Ruch. She is the founder of Mother Untitled, and Mother Untitled is the leading platform for ambitious women who are leaning into family life. She's essentially trying to reframe stay-at-home parenthood, which is a phrase that is so antiquated and also gaslights us against one another. We're going to talk about what we can do to shift that phrase and find maybe a new phrase, but wanted to invite Neha to the conversation. We're going to talk about the mommy wars, how she and I are coming together. Look, my platform is to advocate for working moms. She is advocating for women, ambitious women who are pausing their careers to lean into their family life. But the bottom line is this: we need to support one another and we need to make sure that motherhood is celebrated, full stop. That's where it should begin and that's where it should end. And if you haven't signed up for my personal newsletter at paulafarisofficial.com, you're going to get kind of insider access to some of these conversations. You'll be the first one to partake in some of the giveaways from our guests, which are really fun too. Make sure you are signed up at paulafarisofficial.com. But pinpoints coming up after the conversation. Without further ado, our new friend, Neha Ruch, on why so many women and men are leaving the traditional workforce. Neha, I'm so glad that we're in conversation. I have followed you for a very long time on Instagram. I have a lot of respect for how you're trying to reframe stay-at-home motherhood and what you're trying to do in that space. And I'm really looking forward to this conversation with you today.
Likewise, Paula. Thank you for having me.
So Neha, tell everyone a little bit about what you're doing right now. You're the founder of Mother Untitled. You left the workforce years ago, but tell us a little bit about your mission and how you're trying to reframe stay-at-home motherhood.
Sure. So about 8 years ago now, I had my first son and, I was rocking in that white glider and I realized that I had sort of found something I'd been looking for a long time, which was the piece of not climbing a ladder for a little while. Mm-hmm. And I initially actually downshifted into 2 days a week of consulting, eventually paused. But in the sort of remainder of the time I was at home, I was meeting all these incredible women like you and I, who were ambitious, who were having children a little bit later than the previous generations had, who had equitable relationships with their partners for the most part, and who were choosing to make bold choices in their careers to pause or shift. And none of them matched the stereotype of the June Cleaver archetype that I was being fed around the stay-at-home mother. So mind you, I had my first son on the heels of the Lean In movement, the rise of the girl boss era. Everywhere I looked, there were incredible models for the traditional woman working out of the home, but it was casting undue shame on the woman at home. And meanwhile, I was facing a lot of sort of stigma and shame in my own choice to pause. I was hearing it from family and friends, and I realized it wasn't because of them. It was because they'd internalized a lot of tropes about the stay-at-home mother, that she was going to be bored all day. She was giving up on her ambition. She was giving up on her feminism. And so I started Mother Untitled back then as the first platform, changing the perception of career pauses or shifts for family life so that women could make that choice with confidence, with dignity, with models and a sense of possibility for what came next, because it is a pause. It's not a period. Mm-hmm. And, initially I planted the seeds for this over the course of those years fully at home. And in more recent years, since my kids aged into school, I've gotten to grow the movement. And I do have a book coming out in January that I really do believe sort of is a catalyst to bring this conversation mainstream.
Yeah, that book is called The Power Pause. Excited to talk about it a little bit later in the conversation. You mentioned something about the shame and how you were shamed and how you were judged when you made this decision. Before we even touch that, though, I want to ask you, why did you make the decision? Because here you are, an ambitious woman. I can relate to that, in 2017, 2018, when I stepped away from these two prestigious jobs of anchoring Good Morning America weekends and co-hosting The View because I just felt like this was something I needed to do. People called me crazy. They were like, what is she thinking? And so I very much relate to that. But tell us a little bit about why you decided to pause. And I love how you frame that as pausing. It's not a forever. I say it's a chapter, it's a season. Why did you decide to pause, but to leave the traditional workforce?
So I love that you asked that because I did not pause my career because I thought it was better for my child. And I think I want to say that right then, because I think so often women are pitted against each other.
Yes.
And made to feel like one choice is better than the other for the family.
Mm-hmm.
I made that choice for myself. I was lucky enough to have the financial privilege. And I will say I initially downshifted to consulting. So I was consulting 2 days a week out of the home. And it was sort of a trial run of if we could do this financially, if I actually enjoyed being at home. And then I eventually paused, but I wanted more time with my child. I wanted to enjoy this time with him. But I also wanted to see what it would do for me.
Mm-hmm.
I think I'd spent the better part of a decade really trying to prove my worth in the workplace. And I had landed what on paper was the dream job, but I didn't feel good inside. I felt very anxious. I didn't feel secure in myself. And then I was with my child who really only wanted me to be me. And for the first time in as long as I could imagine, I belonged and I wanted to explore that version of myself.
Right.
And so when you look at the research, and we commissioned a survey called the American Mothers on Pause survey, which we did with Proof Insights in 2023, 87% of women cited the reason to pause was wanting time with their children.
Mm-hmm.
After that, it was financial stress. And after that, it was less stress in the home. I think so often we think about it as women getting pushed out of the workforce. And in a lot of cases, they do. 1 in 3 women do not want to pause their career.
Right.
They have to. In my case, I did want to. I think that's an important distinction because it was a privilege to get to choose.
Yes.
The privilege isn't to get to stay at home or keep working or exist in between. It's to get to choose. And I did choose.
Yeah. And I think we have to acknowledge that within the conversation. And yes, some women, this might ruffle their feathers, but that's not the point of this. We're going to talk about some uncomfortable things. I have a platform that advocates for working moms, and you have a platform that advocates for ambitious women who are, choosing to stay home or staying home for other reasons. And we don't want to be divisive in this conversation. We want to find common ground. We want to find ways to support one another, right? And really at the crux of the mommy wars, and I want to get into the mommy wars, is just we don't choose to respect one another's decision, whatever the decision is. So you decide to stay home, Neha, but what you're doing to reframe stay-at-home motherhood, I think is so important too. And you're reframing it, not just staying at home, but like the ambitious woman, right? Tell me a little bit about if you could change that terminology, stay at home, to something else. I love the phrase slay at home, like the slaying at home. And that wasn't even a term or a phrase that we used until 1992. That was when the New York Times first used it. And stay at home was a reference to people in a Jane Austen novel back in the 1800s that stayed home. It had nothing to do with work. So it's an antiquated phrase and it's used to pit us against one another. What would you love to change that phrase to?
First of all, the linguistics, which, in that New York Times article, which I think you're referencing, and there's a Slate article as well. Ben Zimmer is a sociolinguist who looks at the phrase stay-at-home mother and points out that it implies stagnant. Working mom is very active, right? It's an active phrase. Stay at implies stuck in one place. It implies shut in. And I think, unfortunately, we've also burdened it with a number of tropes and archetypes from the 1970s, right? So if you date back and to the sort of second wave of feminism, when women were getting opportunities in the workforce, right? It was also the rise and advent of two things, television and advertising. And so you saw two things. You saw June Cleaver on the TV screen, and you saw that You saw a lot of ads for dishwashers and telephones with women wearing aprons, teetering around with a platter of cookies. And suddenly we had this very static image of the stay-at-home mother. So the question is, do we need to replace the phrase stay-at-home mother and abolish that completely? Or do we have to elevate and bring into sort of view a more modern version of what the stay-at-home mother is? And I would argue you have to do both, right?
Right.
Because the reality is two things. One, since the 1970s, you're looking at a new generation of women who are having children at the average age of 29 across the country. And it's much older in when you look at the educated, at different socioeconomic levels, different education levels. You're looking at people who've clocked in a decade or over in their work experience. So they have more education and work to experience to draw upon after their pause. You're looking at more equitable relationships with the partner. So modern fathers are spending 3 times the amount of time with their children than generations prior.
Right.
You're looking at women who have access to digital technology and resources so that they can keep growing and keep contributing and stay connected to the workforce in ways that no generation previously did. Right. Why you're seeing the rise of entrepreneurship, the rise of freelance, the rise of consulting. So when you put all that together, you're looking at a much different version of that at-home parent. And I use the phrase at-home parent because I think it does 2 things. I think it removes the stagnancy of stay, which is just the linguistic side, and it removes the gendered nature of stay-at-home mom, at-home parent. I'm a home parent, at-home parent. Just sort of neutralizes that.
Yeah, this engenders it. I like that. Right. Because it doesn't just have to be the mother.
By the way,
right.
1 in 5 stay-at-home parents right now are dads, which is what such an interesting facet of this conversation. And then the other thing I would say, just around the overarching dialogue around the divisiveness between stay-at-home and working parent, the very real nature of the workplace right now. When we did that study in 2023, 1 in 3 women working in the workforce right now were planning a pause in the next 2 years. 1 in 2 were considering downshifting their working hour.
Right.
9%,
That's crazy. Wow.
90% of at-home parents were planning to return to the workforce, which means that we are all ever evolving.
Yes,
we are all ever shifting. And so this concept of stay at home and working, we're all much more in between than ever before. And so, my proposal is let's just embrace the in between. So if you ask me what you do, I might say right now, so it's for right now, I'm mostly with my kids. We will see what comes next. Or I might say, as is right now, I'm working on a mission-based platform. We'll see what comes next.
Right.
There's no stay.
That's good. So I do think we need to acknowledge, and you did just a moment ago, it is very much a privilege to be able to have the choice. And a lot of mothers and fathers, we don't have the choice to stay home. I have the choice right now to stay home, and I'm very much privileged, and I want to recognize that. I'm able to stay home, work from home, work for myself, right? I have a partner who now is, again, a primary breadwinner, another term that we just need to abolish, right? But we are very much partners. I want to ask you in your work, I hear so many women considering leaving the workforce. I think 2/3 of moms considered leaving the workforce last year just due to childcare stress and the lack of quality and affordable childcare. And now those numbers are growing each year. 82% of moms under 30 say childcare is their primary reason for considering leaving the workforce. There's so many moms that are considering leaving the workforce. But I also hear from men who say, look, we have very educated women at top of their field. They have a child and then they want to leave the workforce. And so I think it's multifaceted. It's a mixture of wanting to be more present with our children. I don't ever want to say wanting to raise our kids, because working moms, we're raising our kids just as much as mothers who are at home or fathers who are at home. So it's a mix of wanting to be home like you just wanted to explore this. It's childcare. Childcare costs are crazy expensive. And bottom line, being a working mom just doesn't work. It doesn't work. It's not supported. Motherhood's not supported in this country. Motherhood is scrutinized. It's penalized. That's why we have the mom tax and the mom penalty, why we're paid less and valued less and scrutinized more. once we become mothers. So what are you hearing from your community, Neha, specifically? So tell me some of the stories or maybe some of the predominant through lines of why women and mothers are leaving the workforce. What have you heard?
I do think it is a mix. Like I said before, I think so often one of the tropes that Carrot followed stay-at-home mothers for so long was the idea that it was a luxury.
Yeah.
I think the word luxury is very dangerous because it immediately breeds resentment from the other side and disdain. And then it also sort of diminishes the very real work of parenthood, right?
Yes.
And so you called out earlier that I said privilege, and I think it's really important to sort of sit with that. And the reason I say it was a privilege to get to choose is because what you see right now is that you're looking at a group of people who, some women, yes, choose to lessen the stress in the home or choose to lean into family life for a chapter because they want more time. And you see a lot of women have to pause because they can't offset the cost of childcare, right? And then on the other side, you see a lot of women not be able to pause because they can't forego that part of their household income and every sort of version in between. The privilege is to get to choose whether you are working
absolutely
for yourself, whether you are working out of the home, or whether you are full-time at home. And that sort of privilege applies on every vector. So I think that's the first piece to call out. I would then say when I look, and I got to interview over 100 at-home parents or women in downshifted careers for the book. And I obviously, with the survey, got to take a wider lens to 1,200 women across the country who had downshifted or fully paused their work. And unanimously, it was that mix. It was both wanting less stress in the home, wanting less financial stress, and wanting the time with their children. Now, the interesting thing is it's not always at maternity leave, right? You're looking at women who really feel conflicted maybe on their first child and do return. You're looking at women who, after their second child, feel like, okay, the logistics have gotten too complicated now. You're looking at a lot of women trying to find flexible professional pursuits and take their work skills and devise a way in which they can continue staying connected to their professional and creative pursuit alongside family life. And I think that's the most interesting part of all of this, right? Yes, women are looking to pause for a moment, but it is often a moment to recalibrate what comes next. Some of the most interesting stories I can reflect on is that, the woman who worked in marketing for ages, had 4 children, had to pause because of financial stress, and realized in caring for children that she really felt passionate about education and had returned as a preschool teacher's assistant and then has still returned full-time in that capacity. And then there are other women who try their hands in different things. There's a woman named Neha Ruch who I interviewed. She was a lawyer in the Bay Area. She fully paused, explored podcasting and writing, realized that was not for her, but it did work to keep her sort of creatively engaged during her time at home, and returned in-house counsel for Netflix shortly, 4 years after. And so what I'm seeing is also this sort of renewed interest to figure out ways in which to stay engaged such that when they return, it is easier tell their own stories. But I do think that onus is still on women. It is still on us to craft that story, to be able to connect the dots for how that non-traditional caregiving experience lends to the work environment and how they stayed creatively engaged. And that's really what I seek to do with the book, is be able to give women a sense of, not only am I stepping into this chapter with clarity and my head held high and financial dignity with my partner because we are partners and I am still creating value, but I'm also going to use this stage of life to continue to grow because I am still growing, even if I'm not getting paid for it.
Okay. So you said something and I want to jump on it because you said when they return to the workforce. And so when I decided to downshift, when I was at the top of my game, it was 2018. My kids were, mental math here. Let's just approximate. My oldest was, that was 6 years. So she was like 11. Let's say they were 11, 9, and 4. Okay. So that's when I decided to downshift. And then I left TV news altogether and decided to do something different. Again, I had a choice to do that. Yes, I was told I was crazy. I was scared by TV agents that said the longer you have former in front of your profession, former GMA anchor, former host of The View, they're like, the harder it's going to be to get back in. And so I want to do one thing, and then I'll ask you a question. I want to just encourage women that it's chapters and seasons of your life. It's not a forever. And don't allow anyone to scare you or dissuade you from doing something that you feel very much called to do, which there will be sacrifice. But I think what's scary is for a lot of women that are considering doing this and they know there will be sacrifice, there is a very real penalty on the other side of it. How often I had a friend reach out, very accomplished, 4 kids, wanted to stay home and be more intentional, wanted to get back into the workforce. She's like, I'm scared to even put why I was out of the workforce because I'll be deemed a liability and a risk, when I was actually I was getting a master class in leadership through parenthood. There's a very real penalty, a very real tax that we feel if we take time off and then try to get back in, because that resume is going to be looked at, Neha, and we're going to be discriminated against because, oh, well, what has she been doing for the last 5-10 years? And I say, look, we need to rebrand motherhood because I'm more efficient, empathetic, a better leader, courageous because of motherhood, not in spite of it. But yet that's not the societal narrative. We're off counting Cheerios in a corner in our yoga pants, and we're a liability and a risk. So what do you tell the woman that wants to take a pause, but knows that there's a very real mom tax on the other side of that when she wants to get back into the workforce?
So a few things. And thank you for calling this out, because I think this is the big elephant in the room, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, which is what happens next. Number one, I think that's the point of both of our work, right? Which is flip the script on what that chapter looks like so it can be respected when women return. Number two, I think so often we talk about what we can do in the workplace to retain women. One of the things that I advocate for is the real work we also need to do and include in that advocacy is what we can do to respect parenthood so we can empower women returning, because pauses are a reality. Pauses and shifts are a reality in the workforce, and we need to change the way in which we receive and respect parents when they return.
Right, right.
So with that said, the most recent data is 70% of HR managers expect at this point and are comfortable seeing a pause on a resume or a career break. You're then looking at, and I would still say, while that is an optimistic number, I would still say to the woman pausing or shifting that you have to be strategic in your time away from the workforce. When I say strategic, I mean a few things. I mean, make sure you are setting yourself up when you are resigning to stay connected to those contacts and you're leaving with your network as intact as possible, which is why the 3rd chapter in the book is about resigning. The middle section of the book is about setting yourself up to set your own goals so that you are still very clearly aware of your own growth and your own success metrics during your time away from work. You are setting yourself up so that this is not just about raising your children, it is about raising yourself alongside. You're setting up rhythms and childcare so that, or support from your partner or support from non-traditional sources like a gym or a church or a synagogue, so that you are carving out a little bit of space, if possible, for yourself to keep your network growing, as well as your sort of skills growing. And now that can be an online certification. That can be taking one meeting a quarter with someone from an industry that you're interested in. I sort of lay out all the ways in which that may be feasible, even with limited childcare. And then really thinking about, okay, once maybe call it a few years in, once you're out of the thick of it, how can you use this time to explore the possibility, right? Mm-hmm. So that this time in your life is not wasted. It is really about exploration for yourself as well. So how can you sort of audit your life, figure out what lights you up? Some of my favorite stories, one woman who had been in data and analytics, took 7 years off, started volunteering when she felt ready within the school system cast a really wide net, realized she was interested in events, started intruding at an events agency, went back in event marketing it was 9 years after, right? She was based in Palo Alto. And it isn't, so those are women who did pivots. I think the women who sort of are in, call it academia, law, education, what are and really want to return to those pursuits, or marketing, what are ways to sort of hold 1 or 2 hours in your sort of week to week that you're staying connected, whether that's certification, whether that's volunteering, whether that's advising a friend, even unpaid. And so there's all sorts of ways to use this time, not only to explore if you want to make a change, but also, and by the way, the numbers failing me, but there is a great number of women. I want to say it's over 60%. I think it's 55 who do actually change their careers coming out of away. So I think it's one side exploration, one side staying connected. And then I think ultimately upon returning, one of the greatest things that is most interesting to me over the last 2 years is just the resources available to women to help them tell that story, whether that's resume writers, whether that's career coaches, because oftentimes we don't take it's hard to look at our day to day, right? All those things, whether it was volunteering, whether it was help coaching your partner on their startup, they sort of vanish from our memory. I really want women to be able to write down, if you do nothing else this school year, at the end of each week, write down just the little things that made you feel proud, because those little things end up adding up.
Yes.
And like, tell a story. There's another story about a woman who ended up organizing a bus route for her school system. And she realized, wait a second, at the end of the school year, she was like, I really like project management and operations. And that ultimately, yes, it's just arranging a bus route until you write that on your resume and you're like, oh, that's facilitating operations for a school system.
Yeah.
Right. It's so much about telling that story, and you do have a story, and that story is still ongoing, but you do still have to be strategic about it.
I like that. Okay. Neha, you are very buttoned up. I want you to get a little spicy here. So you posted recently on your Instagram, and I loved it. And I actually reposted it. It said, real feminists don't judge stay-at-home moms. Tell me your thoughts on that.
The first chapter of the Power Pause is really, it was an interesting line to walk, because what I wanted to do for women, it tackles identity. And the two biggest things I hear from women when they're initially pausing is, I worry that I'm giving up on my ambition, and I worry that I'm anti-feminist, that somehow by staying at home, I'm anti-feminist. And I can relate so much, because I remember hearing that from peers in my cohort, from parents, from really anyone who's sort of walked through this stage of life, really had inherited these tropes. And when I started to do the research on it, it really did date back, like we talked about, to the second wave of feminism, right? Which did incredible work to move women into a position where they were respected for their capacity in the workforce. But what we did was we left women at home back in the 1970s with apron strings as a model of defending tradition. And in the 1990s, the media, as you remember, loves a catfight, and started to pit stay-at-home and working mothers against one another. Feminism was really tied to economic power outside of the workforce, right? Outside of the home. And anyone who was choosing otherwise was considered defending tradition. And the reality, as we know, is feminism sort of forgot about family life in all of that, right? It didn't equate the very reality of what the workforce was going to look like in 2024, and the lack of supports to really support women. And I think the work of feminism today is opening up more choices and more support for the real life of women. If we sort of spent so long in the sort of 80s, 90s, early 2000s pretending that we could be exactly like men, what we forgot to do was really own what makes us unique as women.
Yes.
And part of being able to own what makes us unique as women is saying out loud what we need to support our unique realities as women, right? Giving birth, nursing if you choose to do that, the disproportionate work we do in the home and emotional labor. All of that was not factored in. And so our work right now is advocating for the support we need for our unique realities. That includes better paid family leave. That includes more flexible workforces. That includes normalizing career pauses because men and women and families may need to include that in their career journeys. Yep. And so my goal really is not to say stay-at-home motherhood is better for families. It is to say it is one option, a number of choices in work and family. And if we normalize and support all the choices, we create more fluid and empowered journeys.
We'll wind down. I have 2 more questions to ask. One thing that irks me is that it's almost always disproportionately on the woman, though. I've talked to so many women who had to leave the workforce, not just because it didn't work for them, they couldn't afford it, but they were making less than their partner. And so the motherhood penalty, where mothers make 70 cents on the dollar compared to fathers, and we're hired less often than women without children. If there's even a thought that we're going to become mothers, we're penalized and we're passed over on promotions and we're paid less and scrutinized more. Fathers, good for them. They experience the fatherhood bonus, which is something totally opposite. But what irks me about the whole conversation is that, and we saw this post-pandemic or during the pandemic, 4 times more women than men had to leave the workforce. And a lot of those issues were just, well, it's the woman's making less. So I guess if we have to figure something out for childcare, it's always on the mother. And I think parenting is at its best, Neha, when it's a team sport, when it's both parents raising the children. And so if there's something that I would love to see change in this equation too, it would be equal pay, so that it's not always the woman, and there's still the societal narrative, it's the woman's job to raise the children, right? Which is very 1950s and 1960s, right? That's not how it's always been throughout our society. That's what I'd like to see, is the gender equity within this conversation. So I just had to go off on a tangent there. And I don't know if you have any thoughts on that too, like how we can solve that.
When I get into the finances surrounding this dialogue, I think one of the biggest reframes is this idea that we're an interdependent family organization, right? Mm-hmm. Which means that we're valuing unpaid and paid care equally within the home. Yes. And so if one partner is working out of the home, they are crystal clear that they are depending on the partner working in the home.
Yep, that's good.
And so, I think that is really top of mind for me, because, with the next frontier for me is really thinking about how do we protect women in financially vulnerable situations, right? How do we make sure that if a woman ends up in a divorce court, that judge isn't looking down on her over glasses and saying, well, just go back to work. Like you weren't work. I think that is, and I talk about this in chapter 2, which is in the finances section.
I'm so excited to read it, by the way. I don't have a copy yet. I'm so excited to dive in.
I'm sure to get you on. And I think that second chapter, I think I had to say at one point in a little gray box, if you are in a rocky marriage, do not make this decision. Like, this is not the time to pause, right? And I think that's a really interesting one. I think that the flip side of that is, if you are in a safe, solid partnership, make sure you're crystal clear going into this decision that you are an interdependent organization. Yes. Because that applies to how you are both going to support each other. One thing I always said to my husband, even when I was fully at home, was that both our work days end when you come home. Then we are just sharing the responsibility of the home.
Good for you.
And great. I think that is one of the key aspects of sort of being able to exist in that choice, is to know that you are respected and valued.
Yeah. And that's why I love Eve Rodsky's work so much with Fair Play, and making sure that division of labor is shared, but it's also recognized as real work, even though it's unpaid labor, and that the woman does the majority of it. And that's what causes so much underlying tension in relationships. And it's why people end up getting divorced over, honestly, like really stupid stuff, because they feel invalidated over and over and over. Mm-hmm. So that's great that your partner validates you. And last question for you, Neha, and we went a little bit longer. I was really fascinated by this conversation. the mommy wars exist. Like you said, that society has been pitting us against one another for a long time. How do you think we can solve the mommy wars?
So 3 things. One, I think we can all do better at owning our choices if it is indeed a choice.
Mm-hmm.
Meaning, I think for too long we have said, and we've sort of inherited this dialogue around, well, I chose to stay at home because it's better for my child. Or the women working out of the home, it's, I chose to stay at home, or I chose to work because it models ambition for my children.
Mm-hmm.
The reality is that all that does is make the other person feel defensive.
Or I chose to stay home to raise my children. That's what I hear. And you're like, we're all raising our kids.
We're all raising our children.
Be careful.
The reality is, and that's why I started this conversation saying, owning the choice for myself.
That's so good.
I chose because that's what works for us in our family.
Yep.
Like it made me feel happier, because the reason is, if we can own our choices as being for us and our unique families and not make it about the kids, then it stops and you immediately step down from that really antagonistic,
really good. Mm-hmm.
Defensive.
Mm-hmm.
Second part is this idea of, I think for too long we've said one or the other is a luxury. I think if we just recognize that universal privilege to get to choose, and the fact that some people have to work, some people have to stay at home, some of us get to choose. And I think if we can sort of de-weaponize this idea of luxury, that will go a long way.
Good.
And then I think,
and I have to say, I will call myself out. I probably need to be more careful with how I talk about that. So that's,
I think a lot of, I think that, it is one of the big sort of reframes I've put forward, because I think too often stay-at-home motherhood is weaponized. Like the first attack is, well, like you got to stay, not knowing how many.
Nice. Must be nice, right? To have that privilege, right?
While those women are like daydreaming.
Yes, I know.
I think the third piece is the really compelling one to me, which is this idea that it is ever evolving and ever shifting, right? As I said before, and I say it again, 1 in 3 women are planning on 1 in 3 working women out of the home are planning on pausing. 1 in 2 are planning on downshifting. 90% of at-home parents want to return to the workforce. We are all so much more alike than we are different. Yeah. And I think if we start to recognize that, it will go a long way. And I really do see the promise of it.
I'm cheering you on loudly and wildly. And I will probably say some stupid things in the process, but I need to get better. And thank you for challenging me to get better. And like you said, we're so much more alike than we are different. Neha, when does the book come out? Tell everybody when the book comes out.
It comes out January 14th, 2025.
I'm so excited I can't wait to read it. I don't have a copy, and I'm very excited, and we will support it. And
I will say, for anyone who does pre-order starting next week, you will get the first chapter available on the site. So motheruntitled.com/the-power-pause. You'll be able to get that first chapter, which really dives into the identity and feminism.
Amazing. You're doing great work, and you're speaking for a lot of women that feel like they don't have a voice. And that's what it's all about, right?
I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you, Neha. I can testify Neha is spot on when she says that the media loves a catfight. They do. We do. I worked in media for a long time, and we lead with the ratings magnet. We lead with the thing that is sensational because it gets the ratings. And sadly, we have pitted at-home parents against working parents. And look, all parents work. We all do. Parenthood, motherhood, fatherhood should be celebrated, full stop, end of story. So let's just join forces, and we're all on the same team. And at the crux of the mommy wars is really just a lack of respect for the other person. What I really took from this conversation so much, by the way, and I appreciate Neha's transparency. I'm looking forward to her book coming out in January called The Power Pause. And I just think it's a great opportunity to really lay out tactically how we should be viewing this time if we have paused or if we have downshifted in our career. But love the work that she's doing and kind of reframing at-home parenthood. But my biggest takeaway was that we have to own our choice. We don't need to explain it, because that's where the gaslighting comes in. That's where we get really defensive. Look, I can just tell people I decided to leave TV news, not because I wanted to spend more time with my kids. I wanted to raise my kids and form this company and work from home. But I need to say, I'm doing this because it's the best thing for my family. And we kind of disarm one another. We're not throwing gas on the fire, because the moment we say, I'm doing it because of this, we start to get defensive, right? So I think just owning our choices and saying, I'm doing this in this season because it's the best thing for my family. And what's best for my family might not be the best thing for your family. So just respecting one another's choices at the end of the day. Neha, thank you again. And make sure you pre-order a copy of her book right now. That's going to come out, The Power Pause, in January. I cannot wait to dig into that book. So next week, I believe it's the first time that I have ever interviewed a prime minister. I'm talking to the former Prime Minister of Australia about the family-friendly policies that totally benefited his economy and how we can do the same here in the United States. It's a fascinating conversation. You won't want to miss it as we continue to talk about it. All right, everyone, be safe. Check in on your loved ones this week. And thanks so much for supporting the show. Make sure you share it. Do all the things. Let me know what you want to talk about. And I'll see you right here next week. I know you guys thought you were done with me, but not quite yet. I have one more thing to tell you about. If you're watching on YouTube or you're listening on your favorite podcast platform, don't forget to subscribe to the show. I don't want you to miss a single beat or a single conversation. And remember, my DMs are always open. Tell me what you want to talk about.